This is Focus
with Cassie McCullough
on ABC Radio Sydney.
Well, if you're into star spotting, it's a great time right now. These are some of the names of people who are in the country. Zac Efron, Liam Neeson, Matt Damon, Natalie Portman, Chris Hemsworth, Christian Bale, Idris Elba, Tilda Swinton, Jane Seymour, Melissa McCarthy. The list just goes on and on. According to Gary Maddox, the film writer for the Sydney Morning Herald, he reckons there's 119 films underway in Australia right now. And there's even rumours of a new film studio being planned for Sydney and perhaps one in Perth and Cairns because of this unprecedented demand. It's just quite a turnaround. So what's driving it and what are the spin-offs for our local industry? Kate Marks is the CEO of Ozfilm, which is the Australian Government industry partnership which acts to connect the international film community to Australia. Hello, lovely to have you with us.
Lovely to be here, Cassie.
And also with us is Matthew Diener. Now, he is the head of Screen Producers Australia, and that represents our local film industry. It has about 500 members. Hello to you as well, Matthew.
Hello.
Yeah, lovely to have you along. Okay, so how did this come to be? How did the money and the films start to flow in? Is it because we're a safe COVID environment, Kate?
Look, in terms of the international productions, it really is a range of factors, I would say. Australia has a world-renowned reputation as a production destination, and we have for many years. So our expertise is really some of the best in the world, and that's obviously our cast in front of the camera, but importantly, it's behind the camera. It's our expertise through the infrastructure, post-production, visual effects. So international filmmakers for many years have been wanting to work in Australia, and that's something we're incredibly proud of, and that's my job to sell. So
makes me feel great to hear that.
It's a good thing to sell from my perspective. Yeah. But of course, that's just one piece of the puzzle. Another one that's really critically important is the incentives available to these international filmmakers. And for many years, incentives have really driven filmmakers to go to territories all around the world. Governments globally have seen the benefits in what these international productions do. And then in July 2020, so 8 months ago, I guess now, the federal government increased the funding available to the international filmmakers, and that's through our location incentive. So in July 2020, an additional $400 million was put into that pot available to attract these productions. So that's really driving the level of interest and activity at the moment. And then the third piece of that pie is absolutely COVID and how well we've managed the pandemic. And how we are seen as a safe place to work.
Mm-hmm. And you can imagine the kind of chaos that might be happening in different markets where sets and shoots are being disrupted by people being sick and then having to reshoot and to go back.
Absolutely. Yeah. Look, we had a number of productions in train, both domestically and internationally, at the start of last year that were shut down. But luckily, due to the combination of industry really coming together and working as a united front, we put in place these protocols, and Australian productions were able to get back up and running in a reasonably quick time. So a lot of these projects started back, I think it was August now, we saw productions, and that's obviously been much faster than a lot of the territories. But there is production activity going on globally, but we are in a position where it is doing it probably as safely as possible.
Mm-hmm. Matthew, you're nodding there. This has been something that the screen producers have been involved in, this coming up with guidelines and protocols.
Yeah, look, we help to drive, especially the occupational health and safety elements of what that COVID workplace looks like, and actually we were touching on it earlier in the program. And it was really a combined exercise from all of the guilds and unions, us as a business body, and the government. And the other really important piece that the government needs credit for was implementing an insurance fund called the Temporary Interruption Fund, which was a pocket of money that is assisting people to basically find insurance when insurance providers aren't coming into the sector and going, this is a bit too risky, which then, scares away investment.
So that's the kind of thing they did in Cyclone Tracy when, after Cyclone Tracy, the government had had to help out with the insurance.
It's basically a port of last resource that, something goes wrong, the government will help to step in a bit, and it covers some of the costs. And one of the things we should mention is that I think comes up the end of this financial year, and it may be that the government should extend that program, for example.
Right,
because I think we're going to still have COVID on the radar for a little bit longer.
All those kissing scenes. What? I mean, it's so weird when you look at films and shows that have been made before COVID, when you see all that intimate contact. You think, my God,
what are you doing?
How well do you know this person?
It's really interesting because I think Neighbours was one of the first productions to get off the ground globally. And there was, at that time, I think everyone was very fearful, so there was a lot of camera angles and tricks done and to sort of make sure it looked like people were being closer than they were. But I think as we've developed the protocols and as there's been comfort about the type of workplace arrangements, I think it's pretty much business as usual.
Yes.
But there is a lot of testing, and I think, Fox Studios has got its own testing, machine going on. They've done 100,000 tests or something. So it's huge, the amount of attention that's given to it.
Mm-hmm. And then the impact on storylines. We could talk about that forever. But I guess, Kate Marks, the question, I just wanted to go back to that money that the government offered. So you say since the middle of last year, which is when the reality of what was happening was really understood, and it was after the end of the financial year, the government now offers this big tax incentive to companies from outside to come in and spend their cash here, essentially. And what kind of break did you say that we're giving them? Is something like 30%?
So what it is now is it's up to 30%. And I should say, the government has had in place incentives for a number of years. Australia actually, back in the early 2000s, was one of the first countries to implement these incentive programs. What we've needed to ensure is that they continue to remain competitive. So at the moment it is up to 30%, but actually the government first put this additional money in place back in 2018. So the first pot of money was $140 million, 2018, and that brought in, I think it was 10 productions.
So that was value for money. That was
absolutely value for money. And again, that's still that 13.5% incentive, which is what they're offering to get you up to 30%. And then what we were seeing at the back end of 2019 was that there was still incredible interest. So this is interest pre-COVID. This interest in Australia has been, as I said, there for many, many years. But that first pot of money was pretty much fully expended, and our clients knew that. So that's why we've been talking to government from 2019 and knew that there was a need to increase and extend that program. And then COVID, of course, just accelerated that need and accelerated the opportunity.
Mm-hmm. And this is guaranteed for 7 years with the money. So you've given them a long-range lead-in schedule, because this is what happens when you make films. You're often making them 3 years
Absolutely.
Before you actually get on a set.
So what's so critical to be able to give that message to the international community is that we have a consistent and a certain program. And that's what they need to see, as you say, to plan into the future. And what's been really exciting to see out of the location incentive and the way that program works is what we're seeing is productions coming in with a slate of projects. So it's not, there will always be the one project just works for Australia, but in some instances, so we've seen NBC Universal come in with a commitment of 3 television series to run back to back.
I see. So once their people are here, they've done the groundwork.
And they're going to stay.
And
and that's what we're here to do. What we're really trying to achieve is that consistent pipeline of activity. So, we firmly believe that the international production activity here is one very important, but it's one part of the ecosystem of the industry here. And so that continuity of international productions is there to work alongside the Australian content and to help us build a really healthy and robust industry.
Well, I want to hear about the Australian content because not so long ago we were talking about things related to screen production in Australia, and people actually from the industry began calling in and saying they were finding it really tough because things had been drying up. Do you feel that the Australian producers are getting an equal share of the pie here with this introduction, or this encouragement of international productions coming here?
Look, it depends on who you talk to, and I think that's the complexity of the sector. It's not a simple exercise to answer that because we're the peak business body. We've got about 500 different businesses. There's a core group that have got maybe international ownership that have got a pathway to some of those international productions and are partnering, like NBCU, which is the owner of Matchbox, which is doing the work that's happening in Australia. So some of those
Just
businesses...
remind us of Matchbox's
Matchbox did The Slap, for example. It did Stateless for the ABC just recently. So it's done some really amazing Australian dramas, predominantly, but also The Real Housewives of Melbourne. If you love a good reality TV show.
Yeah. Kate, I can see from Kate's face she's a big fan.
But, that was an investment that NBCU did to sort of build, I think, a business capability and create original intellectual property in Australia. So that's been an expansion of that business. So they're both doing service work for some of these bigger productions like Young Rock, as well as creating their intellectual property here. And I think that's an interesting model. One of the announcements recently was The Tourist that Lisa Scott is producing locally in Adelaide. That was part of the beneficiaries of the location incentive. And that's a partnering of a local...
What's the plot? I want to know. Is it tourists getting mangled by...
It probably is. Do you know the plot, Kate?
Serial killers?
I don't know the details, sorry.
We'll have to get Lisa to...
It's got a South Australian vibe, I'm just saying. They're not listening, so we can say... Yeah.
But that partnering with an international... If Lisa had just come on as a service provider or a line producer in that project, it would have meant, I think, she would have done the work and got done a great job. But having her as the co-producer and getting maybe some intellectual property out of the work, and it really elevates her to an international scale so that she can promote her business globally as being able to capture and work internationally to either create her own IP or to capture someone else's. So what I think the local industry is trying to do is make sure there's a partnering opportunity with the international work that's coming in so that there's a long tail here. Because one of the things I think Kate and I definitely agree on is we're looking for stability in the sector. A lot of that comes from local incentives for local work. It comes from financing the ABC and SBS and having content quotas. There have been lots of changes in that have affected the industry. So some of the people, we've talked about the people that are doing well. People that aren't doing as well are people who've had a commercial television relationship with kids production, because that's been effectively dialed down by the government.
I just saw Totally Wild has gone last week after, 35 years or something.
Yeah. So there's lots of those changes that are happening because the governments are changing the regulations. One of the things we'd like to see is an extension of regulation onto the streaming platforms, and to do Australian work with that, because that will do the thing that we're trying to do, which is create onward money coming into Australia from international sources to create great work. It'll give Australian creators opportunities and create a long tail of intellectual property, which stabilises the sector. Plus, we get the benefit of not just having Australia as a destination for people to make Hollywood films, but it also allows Hollywood to see Australian films go global and notice that we're doing great work, like everything
this
from,
is the big fear,
Crocodile
isn't it?
Dundee and whatever, going back in time.
And that's the long tail, which is now actually very valuable. We're talking with Matthew Diener, who's the CEO of the Screen Producers of Australia, which represents about 500 different producers and production companies who are making stuff here, and also Kate Marks, who is the head of Ozfilm, and Ozfilm is all about making those public and private partnerships between government work and sorting out where the funding should go. Because, Kate Marks, this has been the big kind of overarching conversation for at least the last decade, that we become a production company, a clearinghouse for all these international sort of big-time Hollywood, wherever they come from, and whether they're going to be on a screen or whether they're going to be on a streaming service. And our local voices don't get told. We get very skilled up at editing and at computer graphics, but we don't get the benefit of our own productions having as much foreground. Do you hold those fears? I mean, the industry is vulnerable.
Look, as I said, we are strong advocates of that healthy ecosystem, but I think the international producers, whether they're the studios, the streamers, they recognise now when they're looking to place projects around the world that it is much more, anywhere where they're filming, it is much more than just dropping in, shooting a project and going home. They know these incentives require a greater commitment, I would say. And so what we're seeing now in the conversations we're having out of our LA office and out of our Sydney office is opportunities for real and genuine partnership. And in some instances, that could be a genuine creative collaboration. And an example, again, is a Clickbait, or The Tourist that Matt was just talking about.
Clickbait, that describe that.
And Clickbait was a project for Netflix and was and created through Matchbox, so this production company that Matt just talked about, but a genuine creative collaboration between American producers and Australian producers. What we're also seeing, which has been incredibly exciting, is the increase in television, for instance. So with the proliferation of television globally, Australia's now receiving much more interest at that level, which is something that dropped off probably from the 90s. And with television we're seeing more opportunities for Australian creatives above the line as well as below the line. But we've had, I think, more, I think it's sort of 5 television series announced on the back of the additional money since July, and only 4 features. And those television series, you're seeing Australian directors. Young Rock, which is an NBC series, has an Australian director. Shantaram.
Just Young Rock. I want to know what that's about.
Young Rock is
Young Rock
is about Young Rock. It tells the story of The Rock and the early years of The Rock.
You mean Uluru?
No, we mean Dwayne Johnson.
Oh, The Rock!
The Rock. It's a comedy telling his early childhood stories.
I see. Okay.
But an Australian director.
Okay. All right. And the other one that you mentioned just then, I think, slipped out of my mind. Shantaram. Now, this is a gigantic doorstopper book. About 10,000 pages, and people
were large book.
Like dragging it around. When we used to be able to go travelling, you'd see people, having copies of it. So that's being made into
a series. So that's Australian IP, has Australian directors attached. Made in Australia, financed out of the US, comes in on the back of this location incentive. So that's where everything's coming together and working cohesively.
Mm-hmm. Look, Matthew, we've got a question for you. Please ask Matthew about more about the television, the children's television, and the end of quotas for commercial TV, now that the ABC is the only option for new kids content. And virtually this person says it's ending the kids TV industry. Is that how some of your members feel?
Yeah, look, it's a big concern because if you think about it, there was 3 purchases that were regulated in the market, 7, 9 and 10 to make content, and a little bit of activity from NIT, SBS, but the ABC being a major tentpole. So that means that you've got a collapse of sort of 3/4 of the industry in terms of activity. And there's a lot of businesses and a lot of people employed by those businesses that make really great animation, great live content. That content travels the world. So it was sometimes getting smaller numbers on 7, 9 and 10, but it was being also shown on the ABC and shown on international markets. Big problem because it's a bit like we're talking about. This is a whole ecology. So if you pull one part of the sector out, other parts are damaged by it and affected. And children's content is not only a training ground, but it returns well for those businesses. So in terms of that is a major problem. It puts a lot of pressure on the ABC to be critical, as it's been for a while in creating kids content. But it also amplifies the need to have our streaming services that are doing very well, very healthy businesses, making millions of dollars in this local market, but contributing to the local ecology by commissioning Australian work. Now there has been some examples of that. Netflix is being the most obvious in making children's content on the ground, but we need that to be stable and solid. And I think you go back to the question before about the Australian voice is really critical, because I don't think you have an industry unless at its core you've got an Australian voice being communicated to our population and to our global partners, and that relates to the Lion, and it relates to
also,
all these massive Indigenous stories, kids stories.
If kids don't grow up with Australian stories, then they're not going to seek them out as adults. We're going to run out of time. I just really want to ask you briefly, Matt, about what's happening in Ireland.
Well, look, Ireland's got an interesting program by which I think it's a regulation whereby they have a partnership with the international work that comes in, so that the local businesses partner and have a contract to basically do the thing we're talking about that Lisa Scott, as an example, on The Tourist is doing. But it's a requirement of entry into the market. Now, whether the government needs to go as far as that, open for the conversation, but it is the thing that has, I think, built a number of Irish businesses and stabilised the market there. there. So you've got an Irish industry that's really good co-production partners globally, and I think Australia could learn from that. If we were thinking about the long-term stability, then that's a good example.
Well, I always like the idea of turning our eyes to the Emerald Isle. A lot of development money, this is someone on the text line, obviously from inside the industry, a lot of development money is available at the moment for kids' TV productions, but nowhere for them to be made. So maybe this is that other issue of the giant things using up resources, and it's possible we will be looking at new places being built, new production studios.
I think that is the opportunity that's really facing us at the moment, the opportunity to grow our capacity and work together as an industry to strategise on the best way, whether that's workforce or infrastructure. That is the opportunity.
Okay, so some opportunities there, but a delicate ecology. Hey, look, it's great to hear some good news. Thank you very much for bringing us some of it, even if there are some opportunities yet to be made the most of. Matthew Diener, CEO of the Screen Producers of Australia, and Kate Marks, CEO of Ozfilm, which is part of getting the money and also ensuring it goes to